Welcome to Chapter 24 of Traditions and Encounters, the Transformation of Europe. During this time in world history, Western Europe was primarily ruled by the Holy Roman Empire, which was sponsored by the Roman Catholic Church. However, during this time also, Western Europe started to fragment under the Protestant Reformation. Basically, a priest named Martin Luther attacked the sale of indulgences. During this time in history, indulgences were sold by the Catholic Church, and in order to forgive your sins, people had to buy these indulgences for the priest to forgive them. So Martin Luther thought this was really corrupt, and he didn't like it, so he wrote this argument called the 95 Theses. And this was widely reproduced with the printing press, which was a technological innovation at the time. And as a result, many people in Western Europe read it. And by the mid-16th century, half the German people where he was from had adopted Lutheran Christianity, which bears his name. Protestant movements also occurred in other countries in Western Europe. So, in particular, there were places in Switzerland and the Low Countries across Western Europe that adopted this. Also, there was this English Reformation sparked by King Henry VIII's desire for divorce. So, King Henry VIII had like 6 marriages, and he really didn't like his first wife because his first wife didn't produce him a son or an heir to the throne, so he wanted to get a divorce, which was not really allowed in Catholicism at that time. Later on in history, we see there has been a glorious revolution in England as a result of this shift to Protestantism. Basically, William and Mary, who were a king and queen from the Netherlands, they came back, overthrew James II, who was a Catholic ruler in England, and reinstituted Protestant rule in England. So that's basically a big story for another time, but that's basically showing the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism and the battles during this time. Also, there was John Calvin. He was this French convert to Protestantism, and he organized a model Protestant community in Geneva in the 1530s. And his missionaries were really successful, of course, in like Scotland and the Low Countries, as mentioned earlier. One of them was John Knox. He helped to form the Reformed Church of Scotland and also the Scottish Reformation, and also in other areas like France and England as well. Then there was the Catholic Reformation. So the Catholic Church saw how big Protestantism was growing and realized they needed to change some things if they still wanted to have followers. So they had the Council of Trent, and this basically directed reform of the church. They formed the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, and it was founded by Loyola, which is a university today in Chicago. But basically, they wanted to have high standards in education, and they also wanted to become effective advisors and missionaries worldwide to continue to promote Catholicism. Also, during this time, there were witch hunts in Europe, so theories and fears of witches really intensified during this time, and the Catholic Church really conflicted with Reformation movements, and that's how these witches and devils were sort of perceived to come from. Many people were executed as a result of this, and it was a pretty bad time in Western Europe. Also, there were religious wars between the Protestants and Catholics whom they branched out from. There was a civil war in France, Spain, Catholic Spain, and Protestant England as well, and even in the Netherlands where they revolted against Catholic Spain, who owned them at the time. Finally, there was a 30 Years' War, and this was the most destructive European war up to World War I. It was really a local conflict in Germany, but eventually spread to all of Western Europe, and it ultimately devastated the Holy Roman Empire, which at the beginning of the Reformation had mainly controlled Western Europe. And as a result, they lost lots of population, and the empire started to topple. So during this time, there was also the consolidation of sovereign states. There were many rulers at this time, but one of the most important is Charles V, and he was the Holy Roman Emperor, so he ruled the Holy Roman Empire. And he inherited a vast empire from his predecessor, but he was unable to establish a unified state, and as a result, his lands were primarily decentralized. Also, there were new monarchs of states such as England, France, and Spain, so new rulers came instead of just Charles V ruling everything, and they had state treasuries that were loaded with taxes, fines, and fees, so they definitely had the money to sustain an empire. Also, the states grew larger and centralized, unlike the empire, and they also eventually formed standing armies to give them power. There's also the Spanish Inquisition in Spain. So it was started by a Catholic court of inquiry. So this is kind of like a counter from the Catholic Church. And they wanted to discover secret Muslims and Jews because, as you know, after the reform of the Catholic Church, they wanted to make Catholicism stronger. So it was used by the Spanish monarchy, who were sponsored by Catholicism, to detect Protestant heresy and political dissidents as well, to try to maintain the stronghold of Catholicism in Spain. Also during this time, there were constitutional states and absolute monarchies. So states in England and Netherlands really started to show a little bit of democracy. Also, they were characterized by limited powers, individual rights, and representative institutions. One such thing was that the constitutional monarchy in England eventually led to a bitter civil war because of all the fighting over rights and new social classes. Also, there was a prominent merchant class and they enjoyed unusual prosperity at this time. So because there was all these new methods of trade and stuff, they really got to expand their money supply and trade as well in Western Europe during this time. Also, both built commercial empires overseas with minimal state interference, so this is the beginning of European imperialism as well. Absolutism occurred in other states, so no representative democracies in France, Spain, Austria, and Prussia, and they were based on the theory of divine right of the kings, so the kings were specially chosen by God to rule. One such absolutist ruler, the most famous actually, was the Sun King of France. Basically, he was known as Louis XIV, and he was the model of royal absolutism. He built this magnificent court at Versailles, which is this huge summer palace, and it has gold everywhere. And he also built this large standing army to keep his order. He also promoted economic development in France at this time, so it was good. Roads, canals, industry, and exports really helped merchants as well. And these other rulers in these absolutist countries saw France as a model. So absolutism was kind of like a dictatorship at this time. European state systems eventually formed, so the Holy Roman Empire started to fragment, and then there was this Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War. It laid the foundation for a system of independent sovereign states, so that's why we have so many states in Europe today. And it abandoned the notion of religion unity, so religion was not the only thing holding a state together anymore. But it did not end war between European states, so later wars such as the 7 Years' War also occurred as a result of religion and these messes as well. Also, diplomacy started to shift alliances in national interests. Many times, alliances were formed based on religion because it was something people could always adhere to. Also, military development was really big in Western Europe at this time. It was costly and competitive. Stuff like cannons and arms started to come in, and other empires back from out east did not keep a pace, and as a result, they were not able to compete warfare later on when they faced these European powers. Early capitalist society. As a result of all this growth during this time in Western Europe, population and urbanization started to occur as well. One was population growth, and it was largely in part because of the new American food crops that came over to improve the Europeans' nutrition and diets from the Columbian Exchange. Also, Europeans had built up an increased resistance to epidemic diseases because, of course, they had survived many plagues before, and now they were being healthier. So these two things really helped contribute the vast population growth. Also, urbanization occurred during this time. So big cities such as Paris started to form, and these cities became increasingly important because they were like the administrative and commercial centers of these new nations. Early capitalism and proto-industrialization. So capitalism basically is the idea that private parties should take advantage of free market conditions, and economic decisions should be made by private parties, not governments or nobility like before in history. Also, they believed in the forces of supply and demand to determine the economics and price of everything. This is really what America is based off of today. So supply and demand, basically merchants played off this, and they built efficient transportation and communication networks to be more efficient in their trade, and new institutions and services to help facilitate all this trade, such as banks, insurance, and stock exchanges started to form. Also, there was the joint stock company, And these really organized commerce on a new scale to spread out the risks of investing, and so more people could join in. Also, countries adopted stuff such as mercantilism, and this was basically where they wanted to export more than they imported. So as a result, they would gain a lot of wealth in the process. Also, capitalism was actively supported by new governments such as England and Netherlands. So these were like the representative countries, and they protected rights of private property because that was a big deal of capitalism. And they also chartered joint stock companies to try to explore, conquer, and colonize distant lands. Once again, the start of European imperialism. During this time, there was also the putting out system or proto-industrialization. Basically, entrepreneurs started to form as well. They utilized cheap rural labor and started to produce things such as cloth that made them highly profitable. Early capitalism also changed rural society, so there was an increased financial independence of rural workers. They weren't tied back to like the government anymore. Also, profits and ethics. There were many different theories for economics. One was by Adam Smith, and he basically said that society would prosper as individuals pursued their own interests. So capitalism was really good for society, but it also generated deep social strains between the rich and the poor. Also, a nuclear family started to form. Basically, families became more independent economically, socially, and emotionally, so it wasn't always tied back to a village anymore. And these bonds really started to form in Western Europe. By far, though, the greatest thing that came out of this time was science and enlightenment. One thing was the reconception of the universe, so people at this time were debating whether the sun was at the center of the universe or the earth was. So originally, there was the Ptolemaic universe, and this was basically a motionless earth, sort of like the sun that doesn't rotate, doesn't move, is surrounded by 9 spheres. And it could not really account for observable movement of the planets, but it was compatible with the Christian conception of creation, so Adam and Eve. However, during this time, there was this researcher named Nicholas Copernicus, and he is most famous for the Copernican universe. Basically, he suggested that the sun was the center of the universe. It was not the one rotating, and basically, Earth was just another planet like the other 9 we have, and it rotates and revolves around the sun. So that's definitely something different at this time. And many people didn't like it at the time, but as we know now, that is truly what it is. There was also the big scientific revolution. There were many famous scientists at this time. So one was Galileo Galilei, and he basically, of course, is most notable for his astronomy and everything like that. There's also Kepler. He basically demonstrated that planetary orbits are elliptical, not actually a circle, so elliptical orbits. Also, with a telescope, Galileo saw new places such as Jupiter and mountains of the moon. And he even had a theory of velocity that contributed to inertia and physics. Speaking of this, one of the most famous was Isaac Newton. So he was really big about physics, and he basically started the whole field of physics and calculus. He offered mathematical explanation of things, and his work really symbolized the scientific revolution through direct observation and mathematical reasoning, not just, oh, this is because religion said this, it must be true. Also, there was Enlightenment. Science and society changed a lot. Enlightenment thinkers sought natural laws that govern human society in the same way that Newton's laws govern the universe. So it was really this new thinking at this time. The thinkers were actually enlightened. The most famous was John Locke, and he was basically stating that all human knowledge comes from sense perceptions. So however you feel, you should do it. Don't let other people judge you, because from your perceptions, you can make the best decisions for yourself. Also, Adam Smith, as we mentioned earlier, wrote about the laws of supply and demand to determine price in his famous work called The Wealth of Nations. Montesquieu was a French political scientist for political liberty. Also, the center of enlightenment was really France, where all these philosophies were debated. In France, there was also Voltaire. He was this famous philosopher. He basically championed religious liberty and individual freedom, which was rare for the time. He also wrote a lot of stuff, often bitter satire. Deism was also popular among thinkers of Enlightenment, including Voltaire, and they basically accepted the existence of a god but denied supernatural teachings of Christianity. So they weren't really kind of Protestantism or Catholicism. They were just different. They basically view God sort of like the clockmaker. He makes the clock and just lets it run. Basically, they felt that God created the universe, but everything else is under the control of humans. And this was basically ordering the universe according to rational and natural laws. Theory of progress, so basically humans would progress as time moved on, definitely big as well as we see. But the biggest thing was the impact of Enlightenment. So it weakened the influence of organized religion. So even though Protestantism was growing, Christianity was sort of decreasing at this time. Also, it encouraged secular values based on reason rather than revelation. Suddenly, more people were believing what they saw rather than what religion taught them. Also, there was subjective society to rational analysis, and this promoted progress and prosperity. So society, once again, they choose to base their thinking on what they see, not what religion told them. So religion really sorts of go down at this point in history. Also, there were more growth in Eastern Europe. One was Russian expansionism. A big person that helped cause this was Peter I, and he was this Russian king. He was known as Peter the Great, and he really helped Russia transform into a state like many of these other Western states, but we'll learn about all of them later. So, in response and in conclusion, this has been Chapter 24 of Traditions and Encounters, the Transformation of Europe. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one.